We'll get started in a couple minutes. If everyone can take their seats, please.
Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to our Spring 2017 Endowed Lecture Series. My name is Arlene Montevecchio. I am the Director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here on this beautiful winter/spring evening. The Center for Spirituality was founded in 1984 with generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, many of whom are here tonight. These women have responded to the signs of the times, the needs of our world for over 175 years. And our lecture series this spring is in that spirit. Our lecture series is titled Call to Intervene, Violence, Solidarity, and Spirituality. It is my great privilege tonight to introduce to you our distinguished lecturer, Father Bryan Massingale, Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University. Father Massingale is a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and previously taught at Marquette University. He completed a doctorate of moral theology, sum cum laude, from the Pontifical Institute for Moral Theology in Rome. Father Massingale has served as consultant to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, providing theological assistance on issues such as criminal justice, capital punishment, environmental justice, and affirmative action. He has also been theological consultant for the National Black Catholic Congress, Catholic Charities USA, the Catholic Health Association, and the National Catholic AIDS Network. Father Massingale has authored 2 books and more than 90 articles, book chapters, and book reviews. His monograph, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, received a first-place book award from the Catholic Press Association. And in this book, he writes about the vocation of the Black Catholic theologian, which includes providing, quote, constant fidelity to a call in the midst of persistent difficulties, humble service to a people spurned and despised, a willingness to speak unpopular, uncomfortable, yet necessary truths, and a commitment to the life of the mind for the sake of ecclesial and social transformation, end quote. Though not writing about himself in this book, I think he more than lives up to this description, prophetically living out these words. Tonight's lecture is titled To Redeem the Soul of America Toward a Moral Vision for a New Civil Rights Movement. Please join me in welcoming Father Bryan Massingale.
Thank you, Arlene. I appreciate it. Thank you. Good evening. And thank you for coming on this winter, spring. Only in the Midwest do we have to hyphenate the change of our seasons. It's kind of nice. I want to thank the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's for their gracious invitation to be with you and for doing all of the behind-the-scenes nuts and bolts work that needs to happen to make this happen. So thank you so much for your hospitality, Arlene, and for your patient response to my tardy responses to your emails. So thank you so much. And I want to acknowledge 2 kind of very special people here in the audience that I know are here. I mean, you're all special, but there are 2 very special people to me who knew me way back when. So hopefully they can be bribed not to tell stories later. Brother Roy Smith of the Congregation of the Holy Cross. He and I have known each other from Milwaukee from way back when we were both younger and could go up the stairs a little faster than we usually do right now. And also Sister Florence Deacon, who works as a coordinator for Congregational Justice for the Congregation of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and Sister Florence was my 8th grade teacher. So thank you, both of you, for being here. But if you don't like what you hear tonight, don't blame them. I am the only one responsible for the content of this lecture. To redeem the soul of America toward a moral vision for a new civil rights movement. Both the words soul and vision will be important in what I present tonight. There is a biblical proverb that without a vision, the people perish. The inspiration for tonight's lecture, and I'm going to warn you at the outset that what you're hearing now is breaking news. It's the first time I'm presenting on this topic, so you're getting what is, fresh off the press, and it's more of a public musing and thinking out loud than a fully coherent and developed argument. But it's something that's been haunting me. And the reason why it's haunting me is that it grew out of a question that was posed to me while on a panel dealing with the challenges of diversity in the aftermath of the 2016 election. Near the end of an hour-long discussion, the moderator asked this: given your analysis of the depth of racism in the country, what would a racially just society look like? A simple question, but it stumped me. I managed to articulate a somewhat compelling response, or at least one that everyone thought was compelling, but one that was not very compelling because honestly, I no longer remember what I said because it really left me very unsatisfied. The question haunted me because, truth be told, I did not know. It was easier to say what I was against. It is easier to describe and even diagnose the social evils that afflict us. But it's more challenging to state a motivating, animating vision that compels and inspires the quest for the difficult work of justice, symbolized by that kind of obscure kind of figure that's up there on the screen. Truth be told, I am not able to know what a racially just society would look like, or a just society at all, as it is something that I and none of us have ever experienced. As the African-American historian Robin D.G. Kelley notes, trying to envision somewhere in advance of nowhere is an extremely difficult task. What are we striving for? What do we stand for? What is the goal of the struggle for justice? For the struggle against social evils based on the disparaging of differences based on race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity? What does justice look like? What does justice feel like? Such questions take us beyond abstract intellectualizing and move us into the realm of animating visions, guiding ideals, and sustaining dreams. Yet these questions are of great urgency. For as Robin Kelley rightly notes, without what he calls freedom dreams, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. He continues, we not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. What would a just society look like? And what is the mission of social justice activists and people of goodwill in the face of the social evil that afflicts so many in this dark and difficult time that we now are in? To address but not to definitively answer those questions, I propose retrieving the insights of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The mission of his signature organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which he founded in 1957, the mission of that conference he articulated in this way: to redeem the soul of the nation, to redeem the soul of America. This mission grounded his struggle against the interlocking evils of racial injustice, economic exploitation, and the pursuit of war or militarism. And I believe that his thoughts can give us a valuable orientation as we address the need for new visions that can guide us and inspire our work today. And so to that end, I'm going to proceed in a couple of stages. And I know the way this works is that some of you are here because you have to write a reflection paper for extra credit for your courses. This is your slide right here. Take a picture of it now. This is what you need to put in your paper, okay? It gives you the outline of what's going to happen. I'm first going to talk about Martin Luther King and what he meant by redeeming the soul of the nation or America. I'm then going to talk about what we mean by racism as a soul sickness, in terms of looking at it being revealing not just the particular social practices, but deeply ingrained habits and ways of being in America. Then I'm going to look at the vision for a just world, and he articulated as being this vision of the great world house, and then I'm going to conclude on a note of hope and challenge. So that's the beginning, the middle, and an end. Make sure you have those 4 points in your paper, and you're guaranteed to do well. Now, if it goes off or whatever, that's okay. When you wake up, you'll see where we are in the outline. That's all right. Now, the other thing I want to make you know is that, as you can see, that I'm not pigmentationally challenged, as some of us are here in the audience. That means, you caught that. Some of you caught that. Good. That means that because both of my parents were converts to Catholicism and came out of the more Pentecostal wing of the Christian tradition, I'm going to kind of maybe veer from the outline a little bit, and that means this is the Holy Spirit Pentecostal moment. We're going to go with the Holy Spirit for a while, but because Catholics need to do things in order and ritually, we'll get back to the outline so you don't have to worry, all right? Is that okay with you all? All right, great, all right. You see, you got to have some fun with this because, as we'll see, you got to have a sense of humor. That's a part of the Holy Spirit, too. The soul of a nation. To redeem the soul of America. When we tell King's story today and the story of the civil rights movement generally, we too often describe them as a quest to challenge and overturn the reality of segregation laws and the visible practices of racial humiliation and violence that sustained the southern states. Now notice how I put that, the southern states. Usually when we tell the history of the civil rights movement or history of African Americans in this country, we can do it in basically 15 seconds or less. Black people came to the country, they were slaves, that was bad. Lincoln came, freed the slaves. Things were still bad in the South. Martin Luther King came, changed that. We elected Barack Obama, and now we're in a post-racial society, and that's African American history in 10 seconds or less. And that's the story where we usually tell the story of the civil rights movement. It's a very comfortable story of obvious good guys and bad guys, and I use the word guys deliberately because we usually don't talk about the women that were involved in the movement. And it's a story where the good guys won. And the moral of the story in this very condensed version of the telling is that our nation is a place where justice eventually and always triumphs. And because that struggle was triumphant, because we dealt with America's racial wounds, those who maintain otherwise, those who continue to talk about racial divisions today, well, they're the real problem. They're the real culprits. They're the real sowers of racial division. Or as someone once recently put it to me, why do you keep talking about racial diversity? Isn't that what divides us? We should stop talking about it, and then we wouldn't have to deal with all the stuff that divides us. Because after all, we've already won that battle. And the hidden implication is, if people of color aren't making it because we've won the battle, it's basically their own darn fault. And you probably have heard people, like maybe your friends and relatives, talk like that. Now, such a truncated narrative seriously misrepresents what King and the movement were about. One of King's associates, C.T. Vivian, recalls that King wrote the words, "to redeem the soul of America," on the windows of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at their headquarters. Dr. King, he noted, viewed the mission of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, as being the transformation of a society, not merely social change. Now, the exact origins of this phrase, to redeem the soul of a nation, are difficult to trace. Some attribute it to the social gospel movement and to Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a major figure of that Protestant social gospel movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s of this country. And others note that the African-American activist A. Philip Randolph used it to describe the import of his struggle for justice for African-American railway porters in the mid-20th century. And without a doubt, these figures and movements were very influential on King himself. Yet, despite its exact origins, the thrust of the phrase is clear. From the beginning, King saw the civil rights movement as engaged in something far deeper than promoting legislative changes or challenging social practices, as important as these were. Because he saw that such laws and practices were simply the external signs of a far deeper reality, a deeper malady or sickness that needed to be addressed for the sake of social transformation. Hak Jun Lee, a Korean scholar and a prolific scholar of King's works, cogently describes this mission of King in reflecting on this model to redeem the soul of America. He writes, and I'm quoting him here, "From the beginning, King refused to limit his movement to the achievement of African American civil rights and freedom alone. Neither was his goal merely to get a larger slice of the economic pie. Although these basic rights were important, the ultimate goal of his movement was the spiritual and moral renewal of the nation. For King knew that America's problem was bigger than legal segregation of Jim or Jane Crow. Because of the country's long and dark history of genocide, slavery, and segregation, he knew that without a moral transformation, racism would continue to mutate into different forms even after legal segregation was dismantled." In other words, the pivotal insight behind the call to redeem the soul of America was the realization that the external, obvious, and visible forms of injustice stemmed from something unseen, from something intangible and yet real. And in the absence of that engagement with this unseen yet pervasive force, it would merely mutate and express itself in other guises. And King called this intangible force the soul of a nation. What did King mean by soul? For King, soul meant the essence, the vitality, the animating center of a person. Soul defined what inevitably affects a person's decisions and behaviors. Moreover, King believed that like individuals, a nation is a spiritual and moral entity. That a nation is more than just an aggregation or collection of isolated individuals. It's a collective entity with a distinctive identity and values. It's soul. Thus, for King, the soul of a nation means what Lonergan would call the set of meanings and values that informs a people's way of life. Soul is that which affects its national decisions and behaviors. Soul is what provides the frame of reference for a group's identity. Soul is not primarily or principally a way of acting, it's a way of being. It's expressed in external signs and symbols. It's expressed in a people's understanding of time and art and literature, in their dress, in their culture, in their speech. But soul is more than just the sum of a society's externals. Because King believed it's possible for the externals to change, but absent soul change, that is, moral and ethical transformation, what in other places King called a, quote, revolution of values, unquote, the underlying system, the underlying soul, would find expression in new laws and in new social customs. That's what that illustration here is. Society is basically those visible institutions, patterns, and policies, but they reflect something deeper. They reflect an underlying set of meanings and values, a set of fears and anxieties and values and hopes and dreams even. And most of the time in America, I argue, we focus on changing the top part, the society part, the visible laws and institutions, and then we wonder why things don't change. Because we haven't articulated the underlying soul, the culture, which animates and inspires a people's way of life. And so those values, which are not always forthrightly articulated and challenged, will simply find more or different visible expression. And so we wonder why in 2017 we're still talking about racism in ways that are remarkably similar to what happened in 1967. Because the externals have changed, but we haven't articulated or interrogated the underlying soul which those externals expressed. Now, one way in which King got to this was through a distinction he adopted early in his ministry between desegregation and integration. At the founding convention of the SCLC, which was gathered under the model of to redeem the soul of America, he adopted this distinction between desegregation and integration. He said that the ultimate aim of the SCLC was to foster and to create what he called the beloved community in America, where brotherhood, I'm using the terms he used then in 1957, is a reality. SCLC works for integration. Our ultimate goal is genuine intergroup and interpersonal living integration. But genuine integration, unlike desegregation, was an inner, even a spiritual reality. King explained that desegregation is primarily negative, and that is, it eliminates discrimination. It eliminates the obvious barriers that blacks and people of color encounter in public accommodations, education, housing, and employment. Desegregation, he said, can be accomplished through legislation and legal initiatives. However, a desegregated society is not an integrated society. As I often say, if you want to know the difference between desegregation and integration, desegregation, if you want a model of it, picture going to a movie or going to a shopping mall, where you see people of different races and ethnicities who are in the same place doing the same thing, but they're not doing it together. That's desegregation. Or as King more poetically puts it, desegregation creates a society where people are physically desegregated and spiritually segregated, where elbows are together and hearts are apart. It gives us social togetherness and spiritual apartness. Close quote. A community that is only legally desegregated is still, one King said, that's too often marked by suspicion, anger, resentment, tokenism, grudging toleration, and wary coexistence. Does that sound kind of familiar? King's goal was not merely desegregation, but integration. Integration is more than merely living together side by side in tolerant coexistence. Rather, it's the positive acceptance of desegregation, evidenced in the welcomed embrace of the other as a full participant in social, political, and economic life. Indeed, King would say integration is meaningless without a real share of power and responsibility. It's not just enough that we're together in the same room, but we're together in the same in terms of genuine equality. And keep that in mind, because we'll see later that becomes important. Integration requires not only changes in laws and public policies and that visible external realm of society, as necessary as those are, it demands, King says, a change in attitudes, a loving acceptance of individuals and groups. It requires, King said, that we confront the non-rational psychological barriers to human unity. He said these are fears such as the fear of lost preferred economic privilege, altered social relationships, intermarriage, and adjustment to new social situations. The fear of interracial marriage is not something that was true way back then. A recent study showed that a majority of folks who voted for the current president of the United States are also people who find interracial marriage to be something that the country should not be in favor of. Just saying. King's words are even more relevant today, and I'm quoting King here. A vigorous enforcement of civil rights will bring an end to segregated public facilities, but it cannot bring an end to fears, prejudice, pride, and irrationality, which are the barriers to a truly integrated society. Legal desegregation alone, King maintained, is an empty and hollow phrase. It's only the first step toward a racially just society. So what I'm trying to do now is basically say that to redeem the soul of America, what King meant was that we have to go deeper beyond superficial surface changes in laws and social customs. Those are necessary, they're important, but they're only a first step. The true solution to the nation's problems requires a transformation in moral values. It requires articulating what those spirit and values of the nation are. What are the core beliefs that inform and sustain the social practices that lead to unjust social living? If we're going to be people of social justice praxis today, it's not enough to focus on changing laws and practices. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. If we do not interrogate the deeper social fears and anxieties and values that feed those practices, then our social justice practice becomes limited, inadequate, and even ineffective. Part 2. So what is America's soul? What then are the set of meanings and values? What is the animating essence or core beliefs that inform and sustain the visible patterns of social injustice that we see today? Now, this is obviously a very complex question, and perhaps of its very nature, it eludes definitive answering. And so what I'm going to do is to offer a first stab at articulating these beliefs in an effort to stimulate conversation and reflection. And I'm going to do so through what is admittedly a personal reflection upon the Black Lives Matter movement, a movement that has engendered what some have called a new civil rights movement. This is a reflection that was occasioned by an acceptance speech that I delivered when I was honored by the YWCA in 2015 with their Eliminating Racism Award. And I was asked on that occasion to speak about why I do what I do before a civic gathering of people of diverse and even no religious conviction. And I spoke in the aftermath of the killings of so many, many unarmed African Americans, some of whose names and faces names we know, whose faces have maybe faded with time. So let's recall them here. Trayvon Martin, Dontre Hamilton, a young man familiar to me in Milwaukee because he was just sleeping in a park and was awoken and was suffering from mental illness, and one police officer checked on him and said there was no problem here. Another police officer prodded him with his baton to wake him up, and he thought he was under attack. He's a paranoid schizophrenic, and the police officer ended up shooting him 14 times in 5 seconds. Eric Gardner, John Crawford III, killed for walking around a Walmart store with a toy rifle he was buying for his child. And someone saw a black man with a gun in an apartment store, called the police. The police came, shot him dead, and his last words reportedly were, "But it's not real." Michael Brown, Freddie Gray Jr., Charleston, the Charleston Nine, killed while in a church engaged in praying over the scriptures in a Bible study. Sandra Bland, a tragedy when a routine traffic stop ends in death. Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, all of these in somewhat different circumstances, but tragically similar circumstances as well. But the one in this endless series is this one. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy doing what 12-year-olds do, sitting in a park on a swing, playing with a toy, and killed within 2 seconds of the officer's arrival. There was a time when I woke up from my sleep in the middle of the night and I was crying, indeed sobbing. And this is something that doesn't happen to me often, if at all. But that night, about 1.5 years ago, I wept over Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy killed by police as he played with a toy on a Cleveland playground. Another unarmed black man, no, an unarmed black boy, child, killed, taken from us too soon, and how the media made it somehow his fault because he was big for his age, because his gun wasn't immediately recognizable as a toy. I remember traveling, and I was going through the New York airport, and there was an effort to indict the stepfather of Michael Brown under the charge of inciting a riot. Because when the police officer was acquitted, or at least the decision was made not to press charges against him, in his grief, as a grieving father would, he reacted with anger, and the DA decided that he was inciting a riot. And I was watching this playing over the airport monitors and CNN, and watching the largely white crowd in the New York airport as they looked at this breaking news, and their faces were stony in anger and a lack of feeling or even empathy. Something catastrophic is happening in our country. And I don't only mean the morbid, wrenching, almost incessant killings of black young men and boys. For these deaths, as King would argue, and as I believe, reveal a deep malady at the core of America, a coldness, a callousness, a soul-warping disease. For racism is a soul sickness. The deepest reason why I've chosen to be a Catholic ethicist who focuses on racial issues stems from my understanding of racism. There are many ways to understand racism: as a political issue, as a sociological phenomenon, as a cultural divide. But for me, at its deepest level, racism is a soul sickness. It's a profound warping of the human spirit, one that enables human beings to create communities of cold, callous indifference toward their darker sisters and brothers. Stripped to its core, racism is that disturbing interior disease that enables people to not care for those who don't look like them. Or in the words of a fellow scholar, the real meaning of race comes down largely to this: is this someone I should care about? Or, as you see here, the signs borne by twin protesters at a Black Lives Matter rally, or the white one carrying a placard reading, "Is his life worth more than mine?" And his black partner having a placard saying, "Is his life worth more than mine?" That's the core of racism. Racism in America has become a spiritual cataract that limits our vision and determines whom we do and do not notice, whom is beyond the reach of our concern or interest. Racism is revealed today not only in verbal taunts and slurs, not only in the continuing inadequate representation of persons of color in positions of power and their overrepresentation in our prisons. It's revealed not only in the scourge of the killings of unarmed black persons or the militarized policing of communities of color or in the scandal of the undereducation of our black and brown youth. Racism today is revealed and carried in a lack of empathy and a profound indifference. The pervasive lack of concern, the social callousness of the majority of society to the horrors and scandals that are unfolding in our midst. I concluded my acceptance speech for that gathering by saying this. I am convinced that as necessary as changed social practices are, such as better police training and body cameras and civilian accountability boards, as important as a vigorous enforcement of civil rights laws are, these will be limited and even ineffective without a deeper conversion, without a healing of the soul, without a profound revolution of values. That is, without attending to the deeper recesses of the human spirit that is the realm of religious faith and spirituality. That is why I became and remain a faith activist for racial justice. This profound warping of the soul, specifically the deep ambivalence on the part of white people collectively about black people collectively, because it's so often unaddressed, is the reason why we find ourselves repeatedly asking the question, why after so many marches and protests and even changed laws do we find ourselves in the same place over and over again? As King would put it, we have failed to acknowledge and wrestle with the deep ambivalence in America's soul about persons of color and persons of African descent. In his last work, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, King posited that one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in is because white and Negro, as he put it then, have a fundamentally different understanding or definition of equality. For most whites, equality is a loose expression for improvement. I often get this when people say, well, things are better than they were. Get that all the time. Equality is a loose expression for improvement. And King argued, white America is not even psychologically prepared to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most cases to retain it. And then King concluded, the great majority of Americans are suspended between opposing attitudes. They are uneasy with injustice, but unwilling yet to pay a significant price to eradicate it. King would argue that one of the reasons why we find ourselves in this destructive feedback loop is because we've not dealt with a fundamental deep ambivalence in the heart of America's soul. A recent study, or a more recent study in 2001, talked about the ambivalence that's present in American society over racial justice. This study by the National Opinion Research Council realized that most whites endorse equal opportunity in the abstract. In other words, are you in favor of equal opportunity? Oh, yes, I am, sure. But they endorse it far less if it results in close or frequent contact with African Americans, or it involves significant numbers. In other words, A few? Okay, but you get too many, it gets a little dicey. Or if it leads to African Americans being promoted to positions of significant power or influence. In other words, this study found what King did, that there's a desire to denounce blatant injustices and yet still preserve a situation of white social dominance and equality. That most white Americans are committed to interpersonal decency, don't call each other names, although that seems to be eroding now, and structural inequality. And King would argue, and I'm quoting him here, this strange indecisiveness and ambivalence toward the Negro is rooted in the same problem that has characterized America ever since the black man landed in chains on the shores of this nation, close quote. What I'm trying to do in this first part of the presentation is to argue to redeem the soul of America. King was arguing that we are never going to make sustained, effective struggle for a new civil rights movement if we don't attend to the deeper level of the fears, resentments, and anxieties that give rise to the kinds of social forms of injustice we've seen today. If we attack only the visible manifestations, we're not getting at the animating essence that gives them fuel, that gives rise to them in the first place. If we're going to be effective advocates for social justice today, we have to attend to the soul of a nation, those unseen fears and beliefs that fuel what we see today. But now we need to speak of vision. Vision. What are we striving for? What is the shape of a just society? What would a racially just America look like? What would the vision be that can ground and sustain and guide the soul work that the present moment in our country demands? Visions are conveyed in metaphors and images, for they fuel the imagination. If we're going to do soul work and redeem the soul of America, we can't have recourse to simply discursive, rational analysis. We have to go deeper to the realm of image and metaphor. And the mature King, in the latter part of his career, used a particular image to describe the morally just society that he was working for. He used the metaphor of the great world house, where people relate across their differences according to norms of love and justice. He wrote, "We have inherited a large house, a great world house, in which we have to live together, black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Jew and Gentile, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu. A family unduly separated in ideas, cultures, and interests, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn somehow to live with each other in peace." This was the vision that animated and inspired and even sustained him in his quest for justice. And yet I also want to point out this litany of opposites and working together and living together was not meant to be an exhaustive list. We can thank his widow, Coretta Scott King, who continued her husband's vision and ministry and extended his vision and his ministry to include struggles against sexism and homophobia as being also consistent with his vision of the great world house. The great world house is this horizon, this vision of an inclusive human community where all are accepted whatever their differences. Or to put it another way, it's a human community where social differences are neither a cause for fear nor an occasion for grudging toleration, but rather these differences are a source of celebration. The great world house, and I'll develop this a little later, has a correlative that King would say we need to understand ourselves as citizens of the world, whose loyalties transcend tribe and nation and religion. The great world house is evidenced by the embrace of the other as a full participant in social, economic, and political life. This is an expansive vision. And the expanse of this vision is further evidenced by King's repeated articulation in the final years of his life that the three greatest threats to the realization of this great world house were what we call the evils of racism, poverty, or as we put it more strongly, economic exploitation. Because we point out that poor people are poor not because they're lazy, but because they're being exploited, and war or the pursuit of militarism. But what distinguished King's analysis was his contention that these social realities, though they were distinct, were interrelated with each other. They weren't isolated from each other. They were so interconnected, King argued, that any effective engagement against one of these issues required engagement with the others as well. The insight that King came in his later years of his life was that the struggle against racism, what he would later call white supremacy, could not be complete or effective without a movement against poverty. For civil rights alone were hollow and almost meaningless in the absence of economic opportunity or in the presence of economic exploitation. And moreover, he came to the realization that the nation would never commit the funds, energy, and attention needed for the eradication of poverty so long as these resources were siphoned off into the pursuit of war and the quest for military dominance. In his own words, we articulated a reason why he was against the Vietnam War. He said, quote, "I knew America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in the rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. And so I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such." And uniting these various three evils at their core was what King called the profit motive or greed. As he would say, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, then the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered, and the great world house crumbles. Now, it's tempting to read this and say, oh, it's an interesting history lesson, but it's got nothing to do with today. Oh, I'm glad you're laughing. Good. So, very briefly now, let's take an excursus and then let's demonstrate how King's analysis helps us understand what's going on in contemporary America and the relevance of this vision for today. We are a nation that is more diverse in terms of our racial and ethnic diversity at any time in American history. Fully, the majority of American children under the age of 14 belong to communities of color. The number of white deaths exceeds the number of white births. And by the year 2040, 2045, We'll be a nation of minorities where there'll be no single racial ethnic minority group. However, we're more diverse than ever before, but we're also more isolated. What you'll see is a series of slides and it shows that the areas that are in the dark blue are areas that are 85.1% or more white. Those in the dark red are those that are 85.1% more African American. This is St. Louis. And here is Chicago. Except you see that little thing south of Cook County, that little area in Lake County there. You can probably guess that's what? Hey, you got it. All right. You see, there's nothing surprising here. And that's Milwaukee, my hometown. The little yellow there, that's 85% more Hispanic. You can see they're concentrated in one area of Milwaukee. You can see the northern part of Milwaukee. That's where most of the blacks live. And once you leave certain areas of Milwaukee City, your chances of encountering African American are statistically non-existent. But there's a deep connection between the complexion of a neighborhood and the poverty of the neighborhood. One measure of it being the neighborhoods in which people can afford to have a personal vehicle. This is a case study of Milwaukee. The darkest areas of green are the areas in which 40% or more of the neighborhood does not have access to a personal vehicle, a car. That means they can't access new jobs, which are being created in the ex-urban areas. It also explains what we saw in Hurricane Katrina, when people asked, well, why didn't people just leave the city? Because many of them didn't have a vehicle by which to leave the city. But when you look at the areas, the darkest areas of concentrated poverty match almost one-to-one with the darkest areas of the city in terms of African American and Hispanic population. Again, showing the deep connection the King drew between racial injustice and segregation and economic exploitation. Or as one study put it in Milwaukee, is it racism or is it poverty that fuels Milwaukee, Milwaukee being the most segregated racial metropolitan area in the country? They said it's poverty because people who need the jobs can't access them because they don't have a vehicle, but it's exacerbated by racism because the reason they can't access the jobs is because whites are unwilling to support the mass transit, which would enable poor people to access the jobs, or to put it bluntly, to infiltrate their neighborhoods. But what does this have to do with militarism? When you look at the percent of our budget, you see that almost $640 billion is spent in defense in our country. That bar far outstrips anything else that's spent in this country, whether in terms of education or healthcare, investment in the arts, social services. It doesn't compare or begin to compare. As the pie chart shows, the military expenditures are over 55% of America's budget. Keep that in mind as we enter into current discussions over the budget, where we're slashing the meager stuff we're spending in other areas in order to give more to the defense budget. Where does it go? It's not big because we're using it to fund the expenditures in Iraq or Afghanistan. They're funded off the budget. So the real cost of the military is far more than we just saw in the previous slide. And it's being spent on weapons development that even the Pentagon admits that it doesn't really need or want. And it has a social cost. It has a social cost. As we see both parties Neither one challenges the military budget. It's kind of sacrosanct in American politics. And the social attitude, isn't there some kind of law against panhandling? The little guy looking for the handout we give in domestic spending. Or, as Ben Cohen of Ben and Jerry's fame, he uses this demonstration on your right here. He says, it's easier to understand a federal budget if we think that one Oreo cookie represents $10 billion. The $700 billion of the Pentagon budget is just a stack of 70 Oreos. In comparison, the federal government spends just 4.5 Oreos on education, just a half of an Oreo on alternative energy, and a fraction of an Oreo on Head Start. If you take just 7 Oreos off the defense budget, you could provide health care for all who currently don't have it. You could provide Head Start for all the kids who need it by just taking 7 Oreos off the stack of 70. I do all this in order to show the relevance of this nexus between racial injustice, between economic exploitation and poverty, and between the pursuit of war and militarism. Or as King would argue, going back to our soul, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. To redeem the soul of America. Space does not permit a fuller exposition of this important aspect of his thinking, but what I've said, I hope, suffices to show how King's metaphor, his vision of the great world house, carries an expansive vision of justice that runs deep within the African American cultural tradition, but has the power to speak beyond that tradition and to motivate the soul work that's needed on the part of people from other social locations. It has the power and potential to interrogate the myth of white American exceptionalism and the call to, quote, put America first, unquote, ideology that so disturbed the peace of so many in our nation and in our world. The great world house, King said, demands that we become citizens of the world. That if we're going to have peace, our loyalties must transcend our race, our tribe, our class, and our nation. And this means we must develop a world perspective, because only that global perspective will give us the vision we need to interrogate and see the connections between the challenges we face environmentally and also the challenges we face at home with the pursuit of militarism, and how that impacts the being of the poor and us all, and how it impacts the welfare and the fortunes of persons of color as well. This great world house. Now, it's tempting to dismiss talk of vision and great world house as being a lofty utopian ideal that bears little semblance to reality and has no chance of realization. Some of you would be forgiven for saying, it all sounds really nice, but. It's tempting to regard King and those who talk of vision and soul as being naive idealists and dismiss us as being products of well-meaning but flawed delusion. The intense opposition that the civil rights movement endured, King's premature death by an assassin's bullet, all testify to the resistance encountered and demands realized and entailed in realizing this vision. And yet, we can't escape the need and the power of vision. Visions illuminate possibilities that are overlooked, paths not taken, potentials that lie dormant, and capacities not yet developed. Visions spring from and fuel the non-rational centers of the human person, from which come the courage, fortitude, and determination needed to engage and persevere in protracted struggles against injustice. Only vision can lead to and ground effective justice praxis. Because unlike a mere dream, a vision has the power to transform even recalcitrant realities. And that's why I deeply believe that we will never understand justice without some account of the power of vision. In particular, visions such as the Great World House. I said before at the outset that this was not a fully coherent argument. It's merely a first stab at something that's been haunting me. What would a just society look like? And so I want to, as I draw this to a conclusion, recall the 2 points I want to make in this first reflection. The first is to reiterate the importance of soul work, that this lecture series, as I understand it, is supposed to look at the connections between violence and solidarity and spirituality. That spirituality isn't simply an add-on, it's something that's important and core to being an authentic person of justice today. That we need a deep internal transformation in our country if we're going to have effective and lasting justice. And this is not mere naive sentimentality, it's of the utmost importance and urgency. When Barack Obama was a senator in 2006, he observed that the problems of poverty and racism, the uninsured and the unemployed, are not simply technical problems in search of the perfect 10-point plan, for they are deeply rooted in both societal indifference and individual callousness in the imperfection of human beings. And solving these problems require changes not only in government policy, but will also require changes in hearts and change of minds. A revolution of values. Or to put it more provocatively, the problem we face in America is not that we have a President Trump. Because President Trump is us. He's the American psyche, our shadow side, in steroids. He simply reflects our ambivalence toward the weak, our pursuit of national strength, our belief in American exceptionalism, the belief that we are special in a way that no one else in the world is. And so removing Trump alone, while it may be something that some might pray for, will not solve the problem. We have to interrogate the American soul. And yet, visions, while prophetic, are also hope, and hope-filled. And so I leave you tonight with words of challenge and hope. These are the last words of my book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. So if you have to read it, this is the conclusion. Social life is made by human beings. The society we live in is the result of human choices and decisions. That means that human beings can change things. What humans break, divide, and separate, we can, with God's help, also heal, unite, and restore. What is now does not have to be. Let me repeat that. What is now does not have to be. And therein lies the hope and the challenge. I thank you.
Thank you, Father Massingale. We have time for about 10 minutes of questions, and we have a microphone that we are circulating. Following the question and answer period, we have a reception in the lobby, including a flyer with a coupon for Father Massingale's book, if you are interested. So let's open
A bargain.
up to questions. Thank you.
There's a hand up over here.
Thank you. Great presentation and a lot of things to think about there. I'm used to thinking and studying about and talking about social sin or structural sin as being more than just the sum of individual sinful decisions. You know, things become institutionalized. When you're talking about the soul of a nation, I think about, you know, individual souls or conversion of heart, which happens person by person or on an individual basis. So I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about what a collective soul of our nation might be if it is analogous to a social sin, you know, as more than just the sum of our individual sets of values, and how you might go about starting to change that collective soul of the nation.
With great difficulty, and it's a great question, because I don't think, to be honest with you, that Catholic theology has yet developed the categories for talking about that deeper level of evil. We've not developed the categories for it. Right now I'm working on talking about cultural sin. Because again, culture or soul is that underlying essence that animates these structural sins that we talk about, their institutional embodiment. But it's more than simply the sum total of individuals. We're talking about national myths, or the kind of the national ethos and the myth, like the myth of American exceptionalism. And how do you begin to interrogate that and call attention to it, since by definition the soul eludes precise delineation? And yet there is this kind of collective thing we call America in a way. And so, but the thing is, we don't have, in Catholic moral theology, we don't have the language and vocabulary yet for it. And we also, to be honest with you, we don't even want to develop, I'm going to be bold. We don't want to develop the pastoral means by which we as a people can deal with this. So, for example, the way in which we deal with human wrongdoing ritually would be through the sacrament of penance and reconciliation. Except that's all premised upon things that I deliberately, consciously am aware of doing wrong. And it's also about what I do individually. We don't come together in a sacrament of reconciliation and announce that we as a people have failed, that we belong to a sinful culture of patriarchal attitudes. Where can we do that? Now, the Jewish tradition has a way of doing it. In Yom Kippur, the Days of Atonement, it's not that individual Jews gather to confess their wrongdoing. They gather together and say, as a community, we have failed. Now, we do have some resources in our tradition, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. He talks about the sin of omission, and that you can fail to do good without even deciding actively not to do good. Because you fail to do good because it doesn't even enter your mind. But because of our own commitment to the sacrament of penance, where it has to be something I deliberately, consciously, intentionally am aware of, we as Catholics are kind of hampered in having the kind of theological and pastoral imagination to even correctly understand or to articulate what I'm trying to get at. And so, yeah, what I'm giving you tonight is something that's on the cutting edge of a lot of different things, but I'm convinced that if we don't do it, then there's a whole level of human wrongdoing that we can't even talk about. And so then as a result, we kind of look at, like I said before, we look at, Donald Trump and he's bad. Well, maybe, yeah. No, not maybe. But that's not enough. That's not enough. That leaves him off the hook. That leaves me off the hook. It leaves all of us off the hook. And we really understand that the reason why he's where he is because, as people said, he talks the way I talk. He thinks like me. He says what I wish I could say. And getting at that essence of that soul is difficult work, but I think it's really important that we make the effort to do so. And maybe the way we Americans do it is not trying to do it on ourselves, but to allow other people who see us to tell us what they see. Because by definition, we can't see what we're too close to. But those who aren't in the American context, they can see us pretty well. And maybe they can help us understand what animates us better than we do. There are other questions, and folks over.
Thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it. It's sobering, but also very enlightening. One of the things that we had talked about in a history of Catholicism class is the way, in speaking especially regarding the differences between immigrant Catholic cultures and then the American culture, where they're what you talked about, surface level practices, whether it was praying the rosary or going to mass, etc. The values that it embodied, whether it was certain communal life or what was good about society or humanity, and then underlying world views, which I think seems to map a lot onto what you talk about, the kind of soul that animates, that also seems to escape. And it's, I guess, where my question seems lies in a similar vein of how to animate some of the particulars, and if it's whether or not it's in an understanding of who we are as human beings and how we exist in relationship with one another, because some of my experiences with working in Hispanic ministry and Hispanic cultures has been just a very communal understanding of that people are fundamentally in relationship with one another, and you're going to be asked, or I'm always asked, it's oh, what's your family like, or who are you related to, before I'm ever asked, what do you do? And I don't. So so I wonder. So I guess I'm in a similar boat of kind of how to get at changing culture when there's no push to. When the fundamental idea is I should be able to kind of create myself, and it's about the individual. Whereas I think there's a richness yet to be mined and pushed forward in a more communal relationship understanding of human society and beings.
Right. And so what you're asking is, if I've been formed in this kind of more culture of individualism, where I define myself in terms of who I am, how do I come to that kind of appreciation of a more communal orientation, which isn't my first native language in a sense? 'Cause I think that's a very helpful way of looking at that. Most of us have this kind of first native language, and we can learn another language, but that second language isn't quite isn't quite the same as the first language. I think part of what it is understanding, when we can come to understand the real limitations of our own worldview, that our worldviews are good and important, but they're all partial. I think that's one way that can help us to realize, okay, I need to learn that other language. The other thing that helps is, King would argue love is important as well. And I don't want to dismiss that at all, because I think that a lot of what happens in real serious interracial, interethnic love and friendships is that you begin through love to adopt a richer frame of mind and values when you fall in love with the people that you serve, so much so that you see yourself as part of them, and your so-called white friends also see you as part of them too, and wonder what happened, what went wrong. But the other thing, and this gets to something we don't deal with well as Catholics, King also realized that social cultural change does not take place without struggle and conflict. I think there's a part of us, and I think it's part of us as Catholics, who think that somehow if we can just find the right words to say or give the right homily or create the right lesson plan, that people are going to get it. But King was very honest when he said that privileged groups seldom surrender their privileges voluntarily. Or as Frederick Douglass would say, power concedes nothing without a demand. King was very honest in saying that the nation does not move around issues of social and economic justice unless it is confronted massively and dramatically. Soul change cannot take place without sustained conflict. Conflict is essential toward moving the just society. And that's something, too, that Catholic social teaching has a lacuna about. We don't want to admit that conflict is part of. Now, conflict doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be shooting Molotov cocktails or whatever like that, but it does, as Frederick Douglass said, the struggle may be physical, it may be moral and physical, but there must be conflict. And I think, I'm just parenthetically thinking about this now because Sister Florence is here and was president of the LCWR during their conflict, and let's call it that. It was conflict. But they showed us that there's a way of being in a contemplative space even in the midst of that conflict. But it does not negate the fact that deep social, soul, cultural change does not take place without conflict. We can talk a lot more about that.
Thank you so much for sharing what you've been sharing. I've been thinking about some of what you said in terms of, I've been thinking about Martin Luther King and what you were saying about the violence and, you know, the solution is not necessarily better. You know, all the things that have been proposed with greater police training and this and that. And it's not this issue, it's that issue, it's a soul issue.
Mm-hmm.
what I'm thinking about with Martin Luther King is that part of his genius is to say that to the people in the church, that this is not a political issue. This, where, you know, the church doesn't deal with a political issue. This is not a military issue. This is a moral issue.
Mm-hmm.
And he was able to draw people into the civil rights movement who were dismissing it because, well, we're in the church. We don't deal with things outside of morality. So I'm kind of looking at what you're framing in terms of a soul, of this society, and also looking at what King is saying in terms of moving the conscience of the people who are on the sidelines by framing it as a moral issue, which these things as moral issues, including poverty, war, economic exploitation. I get a sense that there are some ways in which the church does that, the Catholic Church I'm speaking of, but there are a lot of other ways in which the church does not, and I'm getting a sense that it's because we don't have that voice saying that, framing this as a moral issue. How, from what you're kind of defining here and pointing out here, how do we get the Catholic Church to start looking at some of these issues, the Trayvon Martin issues, Black Lives Matter, as a moral issue that is an imperative upon the church to address it, as opposed to saying, well, that's not something the church should be dealing with?
Wow. Okay. Let's tackle that, and let's tackle it directly. And in this, I am going to be really Catholic and a good Catholic priest, and I'm going to quote Pope John Paul II. Saint Pope John Paul II. So I'm in real firm, solid ground here. During his last pastoral visit to the United States, he gave a homily at the Trans World Dome, it was called then, in St. Louis, in which he called upon Catholics to be what he called, quote, unconditionally pro-life. And in that homily, he says, part of being unconditionally pro-life, he called upon Catholics to have a crusade against euthanasia, a crusade against the death penalty, and he summoned Catholics to eradicate every form of racism, which he called, quote, a plague which is one of the most persistent and destructive evils of the nation. And he said this was a pro-life issue. Now, I remember that homily well because I was watching it on a Catholic cable network, which will go unnamed. Its initials are EWTN. But anyway, I was watching it on EWTN, and I should have turned off the TV after that because then they had a commentator interviewing a very official-looking Monsignor to get the commentary on the Pope's homily. And so the commentator, and this is good to your question, the commentator asked the Monsignor, well, what do you make of the Holy Father's impassioned plea against euthanasia? And the Monsignor responded, well, of course the Holy Father would say this. This is consistent with the Catholic belief in the sanctity of life from natural conception to natural death. And what do you make of the Holy Father's, his summons against the death penalty? And the Monsignor said, well, we shouldn't again be surprised. This is a signature issue, a concern of Pope John Paul II. He knows that many Americans don't agree with him, but he says that there cannot be any compromise upon our witness to the sanctity of life. And what do you make of the Holy Father's curious remarks about racism? This goes to show how ill-served the Holy Father is by his advisors, since racism is no longer a pressing issue in the United States. To go back to your question, one of the things that happens in the U.S. context is how we define what counts as a moral issue. And in the Catholic worldview, as we've defined it in the United States, moral issues, the ones in which we stake our credibility and plant our flag, are issues of personal morality, basically around sexuality and gender. Specifically, abortion and same-sex marriage. We talk about immigration, and we have very good words to say about immigration, but when push comes to shove, we don't have a fortnight for freedom for immigration. We don't. Because basically what we've said is that on abortion and same-sex marriage, there's only one way of being Catholic, whereas there's multiple ways of showing concern for the immigrant or concern for the poverty. And so any particular legislation on those issues are issues of prudential judgment. And that's where we put race. The other thing that goes on in the Catholic Church that hinders us is that Catholicism has this self-understanding of itself as U.S. Catholicism as being a white church. I was involved in the early 2000s with the U.S. bishops. They were going to write a pastoral letter on the sin of racism, because the last one we have is, the only one we have right now is 1979, Brothers and Sisters to Us. Things have changed a little bit since then, so we went to update it. After the fourth draft, I was there with the bishops, and the conversation went like this. Father, if we say what you want us to say, our people will get mad at us. Or another, my people won't understand what you mean by white privilege. And I said, well, wrote them down. I said, thank you, Your Excellencies. Your comments are more helpful than you realize. But I have a question. When you say that your people will get mad or your people won't understand, whom do you mean? Because I'm sure that there are many Catholics of color in your diocese who will understand exactly what is meant and will welcome this document. So who are your people? At which point there was a bishop friend who was there, and his eyes roused him straight to his head. I said, you'll never get to be a bishop. I said, well, that's not my goal in life, believe me. So then where does it leave us? One of the things that leaves us is this. When we tell the story of the civil rights movement, there's a tendency we tell the story as if the black church was uniformly behind King. And it wasn't. Christians of all colors had profound problems with King. Institutional religion, organized churches, organized religion was not a major supporter of the civil rights movement. People of faith were involved in the movement. People of faith were inspired by their faith to take a part in the movement in spite of, and at times despite, their church. Many women religious were active in the civil rights movement, but sometimes they were active in spite of and despite their religious communities. And so if we want the Catholic Church to take these things serious as a moral issue, we can't wait for them to lead. We have to do what we believe our Catholic faith calls us to. And we have to continue to push, to prod, and even at times to work around and to go and to do our own thing and not wait. I think there are times that we as Catholics, we have this kind of allergy. We have to wait for Father to baptize or bless it before we can do anything. And then one of the greatest accomplishments of the Second Vatican Council was to say that we are adults in our faith. And so I tell people I do what I do not despite being Catholic, but because I am Catholic. I sometimes do it despite my bishops, but I don't do it despite my faith. And so how do we get the church to get there? We get the church there by realizing that we are the church. That's how we get our church to do it.
Let's give Father Bryan another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.